We all have things that we are nervous about painting and therefore try to avoid them, but the secret is to dive straight in and give it a go. In this full-length painting tutorial, I'll explain why I find strawberries a struggle and how I tackled it so that you too can conquer your watercolour fears. Let's get into it. Okay, I've done a simple outline of the line drawing as you can see, and we have a free reference photo and line drawing to accompany this tutorial, and I'll tell you later how you can obtain it. I have traced down my line drawing like this. You can of course draw it freehand, but this saves a little bit of time, and I'll put an information card on the screen right now if you'd like to click through, which explains to you in further detail how I do it. Materials, I'm using the Schminck paints today, watercolour paints, but use what you have. And the colours that I've chosen are the vermilion light, transparent red light, yellow orange, sap, sepia and cerulean violet, which is from Winsor & Newton, and the top colours are all from Schminck. So the brushes that I'm using today are a mixture of brushes. This is a number 5 Da Vinci round. It has a synthetic tip, synthetic hairs, and also a very fine point. And probably quite a few of my favourite spotter brushes from Rosemary Co. And this is my old spotter that I use for mixing paints. Once it's become blunt on the end, they're very good for mixing up your colours. And of course, a flat synthetic brush for blending and lifting out paint. I'm also going to be using Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White towards the end. And again, I'll explain as we go through why I've decided to use that. Now, as I said in the intro, we all have our little bits of Achilles heel when we come to painting, and strawberries are definitely one of mine. And as we go through this tutorial, I'll explain why I struggle a little bit with them. But for now, let's talk about the paint. I'm using mixed media paper for this tutorial. I have done a full video on why I like mixed media paper, and I'll link it on the top of your screen for you to click through if you want to have a look at that. But it does make the lifting out and blending really easy. I'm using my number 2 size spotter here. Spotters have a shorter bristle than rounds, and they just make application easy, and a little puddle of water on my palette there so that it saves me from dipping my brush into my jar and flooding the brush with water. I'm working wet on wet, which means I'm going to be applying the water where I want the paint to go. And I've mixed a really watery mix of cerulean violet and sepia, and I'm dropping it in where you can see the water. This is going to form the sort of really dark highlight at the bottom of the strawberry. And again, for this tutorial, I'm going to be keeping the reference photograph on the top of your screen. I've had a mixed response to this. Some people like it there, some people really dislike it there. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, I do find it a little bit distracting, but we'll see how we go. Drop it in the comments below whether you like it there or whether you'd rather not see it throughout the tutorial. Just let me know in the comments. So as you can see, I'm just dropping in this sort of dark maroony brown colour to the outside edge. This is where you can see the darker highlight shining underneath the strawberry, and it's really important that we put this in place. If you are new to watercolour painting, it's all about building up layers with watercolour, and by applying this wash wet and wet, it just means that we have an extra ability to blend, and it gives that really soft edge, as you can see. So we're building up layers slowly and carefully, and I highly recommend that you watch this video all the way through so that you can see that tricky process unfold. Quite a few of you have asked me about the size of the painting, and you can see kind of the size of the strawberry here. It's compared to the size of my hand. It's much bigger than life size, and I would say it's probably about 2 or 3 size life sized, but it's entirely up to you how you resize the photographs, whether you want to go smaller or larger. I always use a kind of A4 sized paper if that's can help with the sort of sizing that I use. So you can see me here applying the water around that really bright highlight in the middle of the strawberry. It's important that we retain this, although we may use some white paint later on. There are 2 ways, or there are probably a few ways that you can tackle working around highlights. You can either paint around them negatively, as we're doing here, or you can, of course, use white paint if you want to. Ideally, we want to be painting around, which is negative painting. I have a mixture here of vermilion light on my palette, and I'm dropping this in where the water has been applied like this. Now, as I said, you don't have to use white paint to paint highlights. In fact, usually it's not used. And I have done a tutorial on how to paint a blackberry working around those highlights. And once again, I'll put an information card on the top of your screen so you can click through to that and watch it later if you want to. Where these two paints are meeting, you can see me using a damp brush to blend these paints together. I'm cleaning my brush in the water, patting it on the kitchen paper so that there's no excess water on the brush because we don't want that paint to flood. And then I'm just dropping it in, as you can see, working around that first wash that we did of the brownie tone towards the base of the strawberry. So let's talk about watercolour fears and painting my Achilles heel here. I've avoided strawberries for quite a long time, simply because there's a lot of negative painting and positive painting at the same time. And my brain just can't seem to do this. I don't know, it's my thing. It's something that I really struggle with. I think it's just a thing that I struggle with, and perhaps it's just one of my things. But I'm doing my best with the strawberry, and I hope that you enjoy this tutorial. So we're mixing sap green with a tiny bit of of yellow orange here, and we've also got the brown tone at the top there. So I'm applying this colour wet on dry, which simply means I'm applying the paint directly onto the paper, this time using my number 2 size spotter. Now, I always say this in my tutorials, please use the colours that you have within your own kit. Generally speaking, you'll find the same sort of colours within your own set. If it is something you're struggling with, then please drop me a line in the comments below and I'll do my best to help you with the colours if you don't have the colours that I'm using. The set I'm using is from Schminck, and it's a limited edition floral set with a couple of colours that I've also put in myself, and I will link everything in the description box underneath this video, as always, if you want to take a look at them for yourself. Once I've applied the paint, I'm dropping in the darker brown shade, as you can see here. So there's a little bit of sepia, or it's a little bit of one of the red tones mixed into it, just to give it that sort of browny shade. You can see that I'm just applying these really light washes. This will form what I call the template wash, so that we can build up those colours later on and know where we're going with that particular colour or tone. Once again, I'm cleaning my brush, patting it onto the kitchen paper and blending it through. Now, I've done a separate video on mixed media paper and why I like it, and I'll link that in the description box underneath this video. The reason I really like using mixed media paper is because it has a really good ability to lift out. Now, I'm sure there are other papers, but I found this particular one really, really good. When you come to lifting out paint, which is something that I'm going to be showing you in this video a little later on, it really does have good lift out properties, which means the paint doesn't absorb into the paper because it isn't a cotton based high quality watercolor paper, and it also makes the blending really easy. And you can see me here using my flat synthetic brush to lift out a little area there. So everything's dry. We're now going to be building up the colors in our second layer. So it's really important that the paint is dry before we do this. So now mixing 2 petals of vermilion light, and I'm adding transparent orange to one of them, and we have the other one on the bottom with transparent red light. I'm using my number 5 round for this one because it has a really fine point, and it's a little bit easier for me to use when I'm filming, simply because it's quite a short little brush. So as you can see, I'm applying the water where I want the paint to go as before, working around our first wash. I'm staying out of that initial grey browny wash because we want to try and retain that as much as we can. And once I'm happy with the application of the water, making sure that I push that water into the corners of the strawberry with the tip of my brush, I'm dropping in the pigments like this. So you can see me here just dropping in the colours, switching between the mixes on my palette, staying out of that initial highlight wash with that browny purpley tone that we applied, and of course working around the highlights. Now, I said at the beginning of this tutorial that we have a free line drawing and reference photograph to accompany this and all of our tutorials here on YouTube, and if you want to access those, all you need to do is join our Facebook group, and I will put a link in the description box underneath this video. Do consider joining us there. We are a fast growing community, a lovely friendly group of people, and it means that you can have access to the line drawings for free, and of course you can post your completed paintings on our Facebook group and have some feedback from me and our other wonderful members. So do consider joining us there. So it really is about me facing my own watercolour fears, and it's really strange because, I mean, it's nothing to be scared of. It is just a painting, and if you go wrong you can just start again. But it's something I've always avoided painting, and it's really strange. I don't know why that would be, but like I said, let's see how I get on. So you can see me now working around the little pencil lines that I have, just applying those red orange tones around the initial wash of that highlight, just using the tip of my brush to blend them together like this. And you can see we've only got a second glaze on, and already this strawberry has this lovely shiny look. Okay, so this is now dry, and I'm using my flat synthetic brush, just damp, to just soften out the edges of that highlight, which are of course a little bit too dark as the paint dries. When watercolour dries, it has a little hard edge which can't be avoided really, so I'm just using my flat brush to lift out any sort of hard edges or anywhere that paint has sort of drifted into the highlight where I don't want it to be. So this is one of the beauties of mixed media, or even an inexpensive watercolour paper. The blending and lifting out is very easy, and you can see me using this brush really flat and dry on the paper just to blend those edges together and lift out some of the areas where I'd like it to be a little bit lighter like this, and then pattern it dry with the kitchen paper. You don't need to be too fussy at this point because we are going to be putting other glazes on, but it's just kind of good practice, and it's just the way I work. It's entirely up to you. You can see me pattern it dry with the kitchen paper. It's just so that I know where the other layers will be going. I'm adding some sepia to this red mix. This is the vermilion mix, and I'm adding a little bit more of the vermilion to the top puddle and going over the existing washes now that they are completely dry, building up those layers slowly and carefully. Now, if you are new to watercolour painting, you're probably wondering why I'm doing it so slowly and so carefully. If you apply your watercolour paint too quickly, too thickly, what you'll end up with is mud, very sticky and very muddy, and it will look overworked. So it's really important that you apply your watercolour washes thinly to begin with, so that you can build up those layers and have that really beautiful translucent look that watercolour gives, where you can see these beautiful washes underneath and all the colours coming through. So it's really important that each layer is dry before you apply the next, and that all of your layers are with thinnish mixes until it is needed to be thick, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So once again, you can see me dipping in between these colours on my palette, working around those highlights as before and blending in the way I do. So I'm trying to simplify this strawberry as much as I can. We're not going to put every single detail into it, but we want it to look like a really glossy, shiny, juicy strawberry. So working around these highlights again with the colours on my palette, dipping between them all. I don't want the colours to be solid and sharp. I want them to have a sort of natural look, which is why I'm using all the different colours and dipping in between. Kind of using that photograph as my guide. Noticing that on the top of the strawberry, the way I see it, it has a kind of yellowy tone, more orangey yellowy tone, and as we work through the strawberry it looks a little bit redder, which is why we've got the three mixes on the palette, as you can see. And of course my now sort of turning a little bit coloured little puddle of water on the top of the palette that I'm using to clean my brush from time to time. I'm working around some of the little seed heads like this, which is of course negative painting, where we are painting around the shape to create a shape, and some of them I will just paint over and lift out. just showing you the different ways that you can achieve this. So it's up to you whether you want to negatively paint around them or whether you want to lift them out if you're using a paper that allows you to do that. You can do lifting out on other watercolour papers, but it is a little harder if you're using a sort of really good quality watercolour paper. I find it a little bit more difficult to remove. But on these less expensive or mixed media papers, it really does work a treat. So you can see me here just working around that little highlights, the seed heads, and just continuing to use that brush in a kind of pattern motion, dip in between my colours as before. And just using that damp brush to blend. And now I'm using the damp, this is a number 2 spotter, to just show you how simple it is to lift out some of these little seed heads by just wiggling that brush on the paper gently and then patting it with some kitchen paper, just like this. And then we'll let this dry and continue to build up those layers slowly and carefully. So okay, everything's really dry, and then we can start to mix our colours, this time slightly thicker. So we have Cerulean Violet and the sepia colour that we used for the initial wash here on this outside edge where that sort of dark highlight is, and I felt now that we have more colour on it, it needed to be darkened up a little bit. It was a little bit too light. So once again, I'm beginning to work wet and wet here, patting my brush like this. And just to let you know that we have a Patreon site where we do full-length tutorials as well as weekly vlog type videos. These are all botanical painting tutorials, and they are exclusive to Patreon, so they're different to the ones that are here on YouTube. I like to give my patrons value for money, so if this is something that interests you, then do consider joining us there. Okay, so you can see me now dropping this paint onto the strawberry like this, working around those highlights. This is only where we have dropped in that paint. You can see that we have an Instagram account there. If you'd like to join us on Instagram, do consider doing that. We do daily, we try to do daily posts over there, and we also do sort of behind the scenes things, and you can have a sneaky peek of all the videos that we have coming up here on our YouTube channel. If you are finding value in this video, do consider giving it a thumbs up. It's a free way of letting YouTube know that you're enjoying my content, and you may want to consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that bell notification so that you don't miss brand new tutorials coming out every single Tuesday. Okay, so you can see the colours that I'm mixing up here. We have the sap as well as the sap mixed in with a little bit of Cerulean Violet. And now that these leaves, the sepals are dry, you can see that I'm just applying this paint on the first one here, working around that central vein, which is lighter. So this is negative painting again, where we are painting around a shape to create a shape. So you can see I've left that little gap in the middle, and I'm going to be working on this next sepal, working the sap green to begin with, and then I'm going to be dropping in a little bit of Cerulean Violet mix at the top where it's darker, as you can see from the photograph. Now, I must admit, This is a little bit wet and I should have let it dry before I dropped in the colour like this, but it doesn't matter, I can do another wash later on. But you can see I'm sort of charging the paint with that other wash and then just dropping it in like this. So working on the next sepal, I'm just dropping in that mix like this one being a little bit lighter, and just dropping in on the outside edge using the tip of my number 5 round, but you can use, of course, any brush that you feel comfortable with. And the same goes for all the brushes that I'm using in this tutorial. I really like the spotter brushes because they have a really fine point and I find that they help with the paint application process. But I'm just using this one today. Dropping in that paint. The colour green that I'm using there is sap green with a tiny bit of the yellow orange, and again dropping in that sort of burgundy tone at the top. Adding a tiny bit more sap where this little sepal here is kind of folding in on itself. Okay, so everything's dry and I've cleaned on my palette, and we're now going to turn our attention back to that glossy red colour where I'm mixing vermilion light, transparent red light, and adding a little bit of the yellow orange to one mix. And we have a third mix going on where we have the vermilion and mixed in with the transparent red light. And now once again, for the third time, I'm working around the wash that we already have in place and blending it through with my very damp brush. Make sure that your brush is damp and not wet because it will push the pigment away. That's why I'm patting my brush on the kitchen paper, as you can see underneath that strawberry there on the top of your screen, and using a light touch to apply this paint so that we don't remove any of the underlying washes. So working around those little highlights and seed heads, again negatively painting, and of course we can lift out the ones that we miss out. So just building up those colours, working around the areas that we now have in place so that it makes it super easy and we know exactly where we're going with this darker, stronger colour. You can see I'm adding a little bit of shape to this very strong highlight at the top of the strawberry. I did feel it was looking not quite right, so I'm just working around that little shape there. If you do find that this isn't the correct shape, you can use the bleed-proof white that I'm going to be talking about later on. So it's not the end of the world if you get the highlights in the wrong place in this instance. As I said, generally speaking, I wouldn't add white to my watercolour paper, my watercolour paintings, but sometimes when you're working in tiny areas, it can be really tricky to do, which is why in this instance we're going to be using the bleed-proof white at the end of this tutorial. So as I approach the outside edge where we've painted in that stronger highlight, the disappearing edge, you can see how I'm beginning to create a little curve shape where I feel that strawberry is the natural shape of the strawberry. So just carrying on working around the little seed heads like this, and drawing in with my paintbrush like these little curves where I can see this kind of natural shape of the strawberry, just to give it a little bit more dimension. This photograph of the strawberry that we're working from was actually a strawberry from my garden in the summer of last year, and I took the photograph and I cleaned it up. So you can see here, this is the original photograph and I've taken out the background. And if this is something that interests you, we do have a membership tier on Patreon where we show you how to do that each month if that's something that interests you. And the reason why I take out the background is it does make the colour assessment a little bit easier, and I do that to a lot of my photographs before I do them. Not all of them, but for a lot of them, just so you can see what we do. You can see me here just painting in some of the positive shapes. That's the actual painting in shape here on the highlighted area of the strawberry, trying to follow the reference photograph as best as I can here. At this point, when everything's dry, I'm just using a plain water glaze to paint over everything using a really, really light touch. This will help merge everything together and give it that sort of uniformity. Once again, now that everything's completely dry, I'm mixing a little bit of the Cerulean violet at the top. We have sap green and sap green with a bit of the yellow tone, which is of course the yellow orange. And now we can start to put the final layers on the sepals and the stem of the strawberry. You can see me dropping in the I've done a wash of the green colour, and then I'm just dropping in the Cerulean violet mix at the top. I'm using a number 2 spotter here, but please use any fine pointed brush that you have. This is quite an old brush of mine, but I keep it for sort of doing the finer detail. So if you have a brush that you like to use for this part of your painting, then do go ahead. But this is a number 2 spotter from Jackson's. They do seem to be a lot smaller in size than ordinary spotters. I would say this is more of a 0 rather than a 2, but I like to use it for the finer detail. And you can see I'm painting around that negatively painted space that we did on the first wash of the sepal, just to enhance it and strengthen the colour because it was a little bit too light. Once again, using a plain water glaze on this sepal here and dropping in that burgundy tone at the top, noticing how it blurs nicely into that water, giving that really soft, natural look, and repeating the process on the other sepals. I'm adding a layer of the Cerulean Violet mix here because the sepals are actually in shadow, and I want that to be really noticeable on the strawberry where these sepals, it gives it another sort of dimension. So I'm blending it through like this to give it a nice soft blur and continuing the process. Just adding the Cerulean Violet to the outside edge of this particular sepal where it's darker. Still using my number 2 spotter, or as I said, any fine line brush that you may have. You can see me adding some of the Cerulean Violet to the red mix, and once again just dropping in that colour to create that sort of shadow. And just adding some more red to the mix there, and that would be the transparent red light and the vermilion light, and I'm now enhancing the little areas where the seed heads would go. So using the tip of my brush to keep sort of going around that area to just sharpen up any edges I feel are needed, and to add a bit more colour and a bit more tonal contrast. We need our darker values here and there, without them looking too stark. I want them to sort of have a natural kind of transition between the colour on the strawberry on the outside edge. I try to simplify this, and I'm not going to paint the strawberry as dark as the original photograph. We're just using it as a guide so that you can see me hopefully create this glossy three-dimensional looking strawberry, and so that you can join in. Okay, so once again everything's dry, and I'm going to mix, we can see here this is sap green with a bit of sepia, and also we have yellow orange with a bit of, that's actually sepia, and just building that colour to form what's going to be eventually be the little seeds. But for now, I'm just adding a tiny bit of that colour at the top here to sharpen up the sepals and to create a little bit of a pattern on the sepals. So that sap green with a tiny bit of sepia there, just to add a tiny bit of detail. Just to darken up some of the areas here and there, as you can see me doing here. And picking up this mix here, so this will be the yellow ochre with some sepia, and applying it to some of the seed hairs, which at the moment are looking a little bit flat, which is why another reason I decided to use the bleed proof white at the end. But for now, we'll just get this colour in. At this point, the consistency of the paint does need to be thicker than the initial washes because we are applying it in smaller areas, and also this is towards the end of our painting, so we need it to be slightly thicker, therefore easier to handle to do the fine detail. You can see me adding these little hairy squiggles, I don't know what you call them, I'm sure they have a name, just adding some little details here and there where you can see these little sticky out bits. To all botanical painters out there, I'm deeply sorry for not knowing the names of these hairs. We'll call them hairs for the purposes of this painting tutorial, but you can see me just dropping them in here. This is just sepia. Go with a really light touch when you're painting things like this. You don't want them to look too stark or too heavy, just really, really natural. And I'm using this sepia mix with a tiny bit of the yellow tone that we have here, just to outline some of the seed heads to give them a little bit more shape and a little bit more form, to look a little bit more three-dimensional rather than flat as they're sitting in those little seed dips that we have there. So we don't want them to look too flat, which is why I'm adding another dimension with this paint. So the bleed proof white, okay, I have a mixture on my palette here, so I've taken it out of the jar, mixed it with a tiny bit of water. So this is a non-waterproof opaque watercolour. You're not meant to use it for mixing, but it's really perfect for just covering certain areas. So if, for example, you were painting some really fine hairs on something, or you wanted to add the tiniest of tiny highlight to anything, or maybe if you've made a mistake, this is a really good way to cover up any mistakes, or if you want to just enhance any highlights as I'm doing here. As I said earlier on, it's not something I would ordinarily use, but I wanted to show it to you so that if it is something that you want to try for yourself, then please feel free to use it. I will put the link in the description box underneath this video if you want to check it out for yourself. But it is a really good thing to have within your kit. I know you can have things like Chinese white within your watercolour paints or even a gouache, but I find this works really, really well because of its opacity and it's quite easy to handle. But again, you may have a white paint within your palette that you could use in its place, but just a really good way of enhancing any white highlights on tiny, tiny areas. I'm going to stop talking and let you watch this in peace. I'll say thank you for watching. I will link a playlist at the end of this video for other botanical painting tutorials. So click through and I'll see you there. Remember to subscribe and hit that bell notification so that you don't miss any videos every Tuesday.